Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Jameel Art Center, Dubai's Contemporary Art Museum. We're joined today by lovely collaborators from the field, Abu Dhabi Music and Arts Foundation, to celebrate the launch of two critical books that really document the development of the UAE art scene. Art of the Emirates and Portrait of a Nation. This collaboration today is facilitated by the beloved Art Jameel shop, who have a booth in the back, where both books are available, both in signed bundles and separately. I'll leave you with the extraordinary panelists today, Maya El Khalil, Melissa Gronlund, Maryam Dabagh, and Walid Wawi, to speculate on the question of what is lost in the term art. Before I go, I would like to quickly remind everyone to keep their masks on at all times and enjoy your time.
Great. All right. Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. This is a day that is really, a thank you to everyone in the audience. Maya and I, is it really loud? Is it very loud or is it okay? Okay, all right. Hear it coming back towards me. It's a day to thank you guys because we started this book, Art of the Emirates, to look at the last 6 years of art production in the UAE. But I really wanted it to come from the people who were doing it and building the things and making the art and curating the shows and creating the infrastructure. So it's a book that was really organized around roundtables of discussion, interviews, and letting people speak for themselves rather than commissioning essays to have people speak for other people. And I really hope that the many different voices and the many different ways that the art scene in the UAE is structured came out in the book. We did the book at the same time as the amazing mammoth exhibition, Portrait of a Nation, that Maya El Khalil did. And that in itself was also a book or also an exhibition that looked both historically and kind of laterally at the different communities that have formed and the kind of contingent ways that an art scene develops, the ways that it didn't have to go from A to B to C, but the random offshoots and the arbitrary things that happened that kind of created the different scenes and the different platforms that we know today. So even though we were working kind of side by side in the beginning, we kind of came together at the end when we worked on Portrait of a Nation catalog together and really shared these ideas about community and this idea of going beyond a narrative to understand the development of an art scene, which is a really a counterintuitive way of thinking of the development of an art scene, thinking against a narrative. And I think we've followed that counterintuitive thought today by thinking about what is lost when you call something art, which is actually a question that was asked by Mr. Kanu, who's the husband of the founder of ADMAF, Huda Kanu, in a discussion at the Abu Dhabi Book Fair. And it came from an anecdote that Mohammed Ahmed Ibrahim said about when he and Hassan Sharif were making landforms in the desert. He said that when they were making them, it wasn't art, it was just something they were doing. And Mr. Kanu asked, what is lost when we give that very charged word with all its financial baggage, institutional baggage, international lexicon baggage, and we kind of we put something in the category art. And I also thought of this amazing quote, this very famous quote by this American experimental filmmaker called Stan Brakhage, which says, think of how many shades of green, how many shades of grass a baby sees before he knows the color green. So this idea of what is left out and how does kind of the word art structure our thinking about what we see before us. So I think I'll hand it over to Maya, who will say a few words about the exhibition and about the amazing work of Maryam and Walid, who we have with us and we're honored to have with us. And then we're going to open it up and kind of take this speculative question, all of us together, and see where we get with it. So thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. So I don't know where to start, actually, because this is exactly the same feel I had when I started working on Portrait of a Nation too. There was such a wealth of information. There's so much work that has been done already in terms of trying to document a scene at different moments in time, and some really landmark exhibitions that took place around a certain period of the development of the scene in the UAE. So, and also it was at a time where, I mean, we're still suffering from this, from COVID. So it was at a time I wasn't even able to come to the UAE. So a lot of these conversations were happening on Zoom. And also I realized that for early on in the scene, there was a lot that was not digital, in digital format. So not being here and to be able to go through the archives and so the material was also quite challenging. But this is where actually, this is why this exhibition turned into very much an exhibition that talks about collaboration and exchange, because the process of building that exhibition had to also rely on a lot of conversations, on word of mouth, on interviews, on people on the ground also from the team at ADMAF, also helping out with research, on lots of conversations with Melissa as well. So, and I realized that that it is an exhibition, that it is a scene that has always been based on extensively on exchange. Very early on, when at the beginning, a number of artists from the Arab world, because of regional political economic situations, were found the UAE as a place that they called home, at the beginning primarily in Sharjah, but also later on in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And the contribution of these artists from the Arab world to build a scene with also artists from the Emirates was extremely rich and extremely interesting. And it was at the same time where we saw these almost like the growth not only of a scene but also of discussions of subverting the meaning of art, what art means within that scene. This is with the group of Hassan Sharif and the group of five, but also with the group of, from a literary perspective, with Nujum al-Ghanem, Khalid al-Budur. So a lot was happening at this time. So when we looked at, okay, how do we tell a story? Because it's, at the end of the day, it's one story. There are so many different perspectives of telling the scenes. Try to move away from an idea of a chronology and more looking at it from where there is a beginning and an end, which is not really what we wanted to achieve, even though the backbone of this exhibition is very much the timeline that we developed for it. But it's also, in terms of mapping, it's like more like a map of where you can enter it. It has different vantage points to enter a map and to navigate a map. And across generations, so I'm going to be very quick, so I'm really taking too much time here. So across generations, there were more or less recurring themes that were taking place. There was the theme of home, of discussing what is home, especially for a country that is where a number of artists have called it home and continue to do so, even though they don't have the nationality. But also also for a younger generation that is seeing of Emirati, that are seeing the changes that are happening so quickly. So the idea of home, the idea of belonging, the idea of identity. There's the second theme cluster that we would discuss was also this changing landscape, a changing urban landscape, physical landscape. There's also an environment that is affecting also a changing sociality, which is consumerism, globalism, all of. So that's in terms. I'm just talking now of two clusters, and the final two where one is these configurations of togetherness. In this grouping, I was mainly concentrating on what was happening around the group of Hassan Sharif, but also as reflecting of what Hassan Sharif and the other artists were. What they triggered when you think that it wasn't art what they're doing in Khorfakan or but it's actually for them it was art. This is exactly the essence of what Hassan Sharif, Muhammad Ahmad Ibrahim, Muhammad Qazim, they were discussing these ideas of what art is, and that was already this tension that was existing of what do you define as art, and where does art should art be taking place. So that was around the cluster, but also the collaboration that were taking place, also more collaboration to the present day, and how this translated into a different language. And this is where we're talking about the language of between the visual languages of performance, performance, sign language, auditory, and so I'll come now to the work of Maryam and Walid, and actually both of them were more within that cluster of talking about home and identity, and each one did it in a very, I mean, poetry is so an intrinsic part of this exhibition and of the work of so many of these artists, but. Walid, you presented something you called that the interstellar migrant. And I remember when I just read, it was only sketches and maybe 5 or 6 lines of telling the audience or the public what you need to do in that space, just how you walk in, how you lie down, how you look up. And I was so, I'm going to you to talk about it, but it was so moving. But yeah, it's like, how did you start thinking about why the stars? Because other artists also address the same themes, sometimes with the same material, with the same topics, but in a completely different understanding. Or Okay, so I'll explain from my perspective. So basically, it's a performance. You go into a black room, and there is the constellation on the sky. And you go in, and you have to put a headphone on your head, and there is a series of instructions. It tells you, close your eyes, then lie down, look up at the star, look at the stars, choose a star. Stretch your hand, grab a star, close your eyes, put your hands in your pocket, and never look back at the star again. Is it something like this?
Yeah. So the idea behind you choosing a star and really like possessing that star and keeping it for yourself is somewhat comforting, but also practically impossible. The idea is, if you, the instruction says actually, if you ever take the star out of your pocket, or if you ever look at the night sky again, then the star is no longer there, because you're confronted with the truth that the star is actually still up there and you never possessed it in the first place. And to go back to what you were asking about, why is it the stars? I mean, there is this extreme disconnect with land, at least for me as a Palestinian. Land for me is this hypothetical thing. I've never been to Palestine, I've never touched the sand, I've never touched the land. And all my life it's been my identity. It revolved around this surface that I probably will never touch, or, I mean, who knows, maybe in the future. And that disconnect, that facade of gravity that we have to go through every day. You walk on Earth. You go from one country to another. You travel. You do this. You do that. But you're always disconnected from that part of the world, or that kind of idea of what land is to you, which is a lot. Which goes beyond gravity and, again, the surfaces. So the stars felt like the most representing of that concept. You know, something so far away. You know it's a land. You know it exists, but you probably will never touch it as well. And that feeling of ownership, which is something you cannot probably get in real life, is something you can fool yourself into feeling comfort through.
I'll sum very quickly the work of Maryam. Actually, the work of Maryam was launched here, so it was shown here in library circles, and Kanya Makan, and it's again playing on the story between Shahrazad and 1001 Light, and another story of belonging and identity. Maryam.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, everyone. So the project started as a commission from the Jamil Library, and in 2020, and it was the time when my family was, so pre-pandemic, a month before the outbreak of the pandemic, my family was packing 45 years of their life here to leave, to go back, and my parents mainly. And obviously there's always reluctant return, right? It's never a desired return, or not anymore. And I remember going through their paperwork of 45 years in the UAE and thinking that this is a history of a country, right? Like these are all historical documents. How do I document them without really removing with preserving the integrity and the dignity of my parents who are now choosing to leave rather than being asked to leave. Just a disclaimer, my parents never left because the pandemic shut down the borders, and they realized when the pandemic shut down the borders that this is a country that won't let them leave. So it became a very poetic kind of relationship where the country really is forcing them not to leave. And so now they live between here and another two countries. But while we were packing, I realized that the only way to tell a story is to really just tell a story, right? So without the need to go into kind of bigger arguments, I wanted to tell the story of a history that rewrites itself every 2 years. And then that reminded me of the stories that we used to read when we were children, which is Alf Layla wa Layla, which are not very appropriate for children, by the way, but we read them a lot when we were kids. And these stories also have this idea of a story that begins at night and then cliffs into the other morning. So there's always something that at the end of the story that takes you or makes you excited to hear the next chapter. And it felt very similar to my parents' life and my life. So I told the story. And the story is beautiful. The story is nostalgic. The story is not sad. The story is just about bits and pieces of what I saw in these archives and what I remember from my childhood, of places that don't exist anymore in Sharjah, for example, of memories that don't have a geographical space to exist as well in. And I remember something a friend of mine said, Natasha, I used to work with in some projects in Art Dubai. She used to say that we carry our memories with us. We carry our memories on our backs with us in the UAE because there's always constant change, right? So things are changing, geographies are changing, so you don't have a place for these memories. And I just thought that going back to the essence of all kind of expression, storytelling, something that is embedded in our DNA, is something that would pay tribute to this history. And so began the story of the commission at the Jameel Art Center. What was shown in Abu Dhabi was the audio piece that I've recorded with the Jameel Art Center. So because of the pandemic as well, and the work, for those of you who didn't see, was I was very fortunate that the team actually made the work visible throughout the museum, throughout the spaces of the museum. So you'd find it in elevators, in washrooms, and walls everywhere. But because of access and the pandemic, another version of it existed online, and it was a recording with my own voice that we also did here with a mask on and a mic, and it was very, very interesting. So that's the story of the work.
But Maryam, I remember when I interviewed you about it for the National, you weren't sure if you wanted to call it an artwork. And that's kind of one of the reasons we invited the two of you, or thought of the two of you when we thought of this topic, is that you both seem to appreciate the latitude and the options and the power that art can give you, but you also resist it. You know, pockets of questioning maybe the fit or the parameters around it. And I want to pick up on that and kind of push you a little bit on why you were loath to call it an artwork.
It's a very, very tough question for me because there are so many facets, so many aspects to this thing. First of all, I've been working in the art scene or the developing art scene since 2004. So I was really a kid back then, and I met so many wonderful people who are instrumental in the making, or were and continue to be instrumental in the making of the art scene as it is today. And I've always held so much respect, and I was always in awe of artists. I mean, I've had coffees and laughed and lunches and conversations with Hassan Sharif and Muhammad Kadhim, Dr. Najat Makki, and of course the list goes on and on and on until my work as in the Venice internship program, where I met some of the people that are my best friends today, and they're phenomenal artists. So there's always that element of awe. Like, I've always worked with artists, but I've never been one of them. So all of a sudden, being called one of them felt like I was invited to like an all-exclusive, I mean, like the cool table, basically. But then when I really thought about it, I realized that my reluctance was that I myself had some issues with with the art scene, not here specifically, like this is in general, that I've always personally felt that it was a bit exclusive. It's not about a space being free or not, it's not about an exhibition being understood or not, but there was always an element of discomfort that I've felt in specific aspects of the art scene that I never really been able to articulate. At some point in my career, I thought it was the lack of inclusive language, specifically the language that I speak, which is Arabic, which is also the official language of the country. And so I started a quest, and you remember, I started a quest to knocking on doors of cultural organizations saying that I'll translate for free, just let's have Arabic as well, let's open up our audiences. And of course, I made the case for other languages as well, but I will not speak on behalf of other communities. I do not speak the language, I have no right. But then that also became, I continue to do this, not for free, but I continue to do this. But there's also something else, like there's also another level of discomfort. And is it the fact that I feel that I'm unable to invite people from my own family who are extremely educated, but do not necessarily belong to the scene or partake in the scene. The fact that I feel that when they come, they don't feel included. And that reoccurring thing that I continuously hear from friends and family, and even sometimes my partner, that please don't force me to go to this opening. I always feel like I'm an outsider. And there's all of these things. And again, I don't have an articulate answer for your question, but I always felt that being a writer, or even the fact that my work was commissioned by the Jamil Library, it sat in the library. Yes, it extended, it spilled into the museum, but it originated and ended at the library. It felt so comfortable for me that it was a piece of research. It was simple language, it was colloquial, it was Fusha, it was English, and when you called me an artist, and when other people started calling me an artist, I was like, but wait, it's understood. It's simpler than that. It's way more accessible. And I don't know why I said that. Until this day, I work with art organizations. I know that some of the programs are phenomenal for the community, but I still believe that a big portion of that, at least this, I don't know what it is, but a big portion of it is inaccessible. And this is something I'm very uncomfortable with, personally.
Yeah, I think that in accessibility, my parents have the same, my brother will take something that I write and then circle the words he understands and send it back to me. It'll be like, and, the, is, thanks a lot. But I think that exclusionary aspect is something that goes beyond the UAE art scene. It's a function of contemporary art. But this it has this push and pull with exclusion and with elitism, which, first of all, it's difficult to talk about because nobody, it's a bit of an uncomfortable subject. Nobody wants to be elitist. And at the same time, art is trying to be as inclusive as possible, even in a formal maneuver. If you look at Documenta, bringing in social aesthetics, bringing in culinary arts, bringing in smells, bringing in research project. This is the really interesting work that's being done. But at the same time, art allows these things in, but yet somehow this problem of access remains. And I think that's it's an interesting one to think about in the context of the UAE, because the UAE art system is so new, and we've developed from a place of almost a radical openness to a place where I think we're trying to keep that openness alive.
Great.
I think something that makes our art practices or the art scene a bit problematic for me is the fact that I believe art is there for engagement and to activate communities or stories or groups of people, but art seems to draw a distance instead. There is, again, maybe it's the elitist attitude behind the art scene or the art system, but it drives a gap between an artist and the audience. So once you're called an artist, there is this instant gap of lack of comprehension of what you do and what is it, what are you about exactly, which discourages you from, or not discourages you, but it kind of takes the tool of engagement away from you. There is this emphasis on being a mystery as an artist, you know. This art is mysterious, it's conceptual, it's very, it's for the intellectual, etc. And it really scares people away because I think it should be a tool for communication rather than a tool for segregation, which is actually kind of happening nowadays to an extent. One of these things that the art system specifically really thrives at is jargon. We use so much jargon to describe so many things that can be just so easily spoken of about, etc. To a point where even the word artist have become a jargon, you know, a part of this jargon. If I want to say I'm an artist, really hardly anyone outside my family would never understand what that is. Some people would be like, "Oh, do you paint, or if I say I'm a contemporary artist, then do you dance?" It's like it's just have become so broad and so vague and so mysterious that it's no longer serving itself. Yeah, and I think it comes from this idea of trying to define what art is, and we're trying to define what being an artist is, and therefore, like Maryam mentioned once before in a previous conversation, where we try to include everything under the art umbrella, all creative practices, and what ends up happening is that as we try to define the word artist, we make it more and more vague. So we try to frame it, but it becomes even more hard to understand.
I think we're forgetting also something, that it's maybe we are being too ambitious with what we want to, not as art, as the artists have to carry on them, because there is also it's an ecosystem. There's also the big role that the culture critique plays in this. So when artists, the work itself does not really have to be, the artist should not be worried about how the public is going to be receiving the work. I mean, obviously there is the public in consideration, but there is also the idea of who talks about the art, who critiques the art, and we're lacking in our part of the world the professional cultural critique who translates, who also almost like acts as a go-between between the public, the general public, and between the world of abstract ideas or the work of the artist. And it's not journalism. It's maybe like a type of slow, deep type of journalism where you get into ideas and you link the past with the future. So it's not about also talking about the present. The role of the cultural critique is so important in bridging that understanding and making the practice of the artist more open and more reachable, more understandable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question is also a problem of the art world becoming ever more insular. But I'm also aware that we seem to be like four people who care deeply about art in front of an audience who cares deeply about art, talking about art's failures. Maybe we should also flip it around and say, because I remember in our discussion before this, you said you feel worried about calling yourself an artist, but when you saw your artwork on the walls, it gave you a feeling of power that was more extraordinary than publication. Maybe we could, of course, take that avenue.
I mean, there's no denial. I mean, again, when I started the conversation, I said that I've literally spent, I don't know how many years is it, since 2004? I'm scared to count. But that many years admiring artists and their contributions and their roles, and the fact that a lot of the subjects that are not, that you cannot really write about, not necessarily political or social or anything, but really there are no words that can maybe at this point in time describe or express what you're going through or a certain human condition. Art is doing great like art did and continue to do great in that. And artists, there are so many artists that I work with or have encountered in my career that are actually raising awareness about issues that I personally didn't know about before encountering their work. So there's no denial in that. And when my work was up in a museum, my work is up in a museum. And for the rest of my life until I die, my writings were up in the museum, like on the walls of a museum. And this is something that is huge. And it's an accomplishment. It's a privilege and an honor. And I'll forever be grateful for the Jameel Art Center for giving me this opportunity. But I think what we are trying to, I think it's because I always say, when you love something or someone so much, you care so deeply for them, you start thinking about what is it that I can do to make this relationship better, right? Like this is an ongoing relationship that will never end. And I think one of the things that we've discussed as well in our previous conversation was the importance of like authentic storytelling around art. And this is, I think, goes to what you were saying. So the cultural critique beyond articles and beyond journalism, the cultural programming, the community programming, the authentic community programming. And there are so many amazing examples that are happening in the UAE of that, where an exhibition that is very difficult to comprehend, either visually or from like the text that accompany this exhibition, become very accessible, easy to grasp programs for adults and children alike. And then that's when you see people coming in from all walks of life. I mean, specific walks of life who have access or to know about. That's another thing. Like people who receive a newsletter from a museum or a cultural organization are the people who signed up for this newsletter. It's very different than being a retail shop where you get unsolicited messages all the time about what's happening with them. So it is still a controlled group, but nevertheless, it's a group that wouldn't have necessarily had access or wanted to come to the exhibition. The other thing that I wanted to say is the importance of what's happening right now, and this is something I see in so many cultural organizations, is the emphasis, or like at least the deliberate effort to not only translate into the official language of the country, which is Arabic, but to also translate to other languages, especially when the exhibitions are concerned with these communities, so that these languages then become invitations for these communities to participate in exhibitions that are by artists from their own. So there are amazing things, but there is also an issue of accessibility. I think it's not about elitism. I mean, I'm always very careful on how to use this word, because I could be an elitist in ways that I can't. I mean, like, this is something. It's a practice on a daily basis. There are things that we do that we don't comprehend how exclusive they can be. But it's really about how, as cultural organizations, institutions, artists. I mean, how can we make sure, not when we produce work that it's for everyone, but when we produce a work, how do we ensure that it has authentic storytelling afterwards? That's how I see it. Again, this is my opinion. And storytelling around an exhibition or a piece of work is really what humbles the approach to everybody and makes it more accessible, in my opinion, to a larger segment of the community, which I believe is really important.
Well, both of your work was really instrumental in that kind of 2014, 2015 time period. But, you know, when both of you started making, well, you started writing essays, you started making work. You had the Campus Art Dubai, which convened so many people and was such an important hotbed for ideas and sharing those ideas, more importantly. And I think there was that moment when the purview of art in the UAE started opening up to other demographics and kind of acknowledging and celebrating the fact that the UAE society is such a diverse and incredibly varied society. And I think you can really see the fruits of that in the Jameel, of all places, not just being a hometown team, but if you look at Mortaza Vali's exhibition for Pakistan and India, I can't remember the title, but it's the anniversary of partition. I mean, to have that exhibition in an institution really is the end of a journey, not to be too chronological, of something that both of you started. So there is, in a sense, you know, that kind of authentic storytelling has been institutionalized in a way that's, very responsive to the people on the ground.
Agreed.
Should we open it up for questions now? Yes, go on, Moza.
Hello. So I just want to add to some of the things that were said about accessibility and kind of like the celebratorial element of the exhibition. Going back to the first question of what is lost when we use the word art, and how Muhammad Ahmed Ibrahim and Hassan Sharif were doing all these things and not calling them art. I wonder how much of that stems out of fear, like some of the things that were addressed in that exhibition, whether they were newly commissioned or done a long time ago. Like, I wonder how many of us had to work in the arts instead of being actual activists and journalists and, be so explicit. And then what are the, I think what is lost is maybe when the institution itself doesn't gather us back to, have this feedback of what was the, outcome of having been implicated and participated in a big exhibition like this, and what are our responsibilities, but also the institution's responsibilities, even in taking care of the artists themselves in terms of artist fees and what they really wanted to say, the text that goes into these books that has to be edited. I'm actually having a physical reaction to this because it is really uncomfortable. I don't think it's an accomplishment to get all the communities in a museum or in an institution. I work with farmers a lot, and I don't think my biggest goal is to get these farmers in a museum space, because that also is perpetuating the idea that the museum space is the top of the hierarchy scenario that people need to come and disseminate knowledge and absorb knowledge from. And even though there's successes like the Murtaza Valley show, but I also wonder, who that really also speaks to. I mean, I don't know, but we don't engage enough to find out. And I think what I'm maybe really concerned about is this constant kind of like turning around into like, let's celebrate even more instead of let's actually sit in the critique, and let's hold ourselves and these institutions accountable for so much more. So I would really appreciate kind of unpacking that a little bit more.
If I can comment on Moza's, I think what you just said is extremely important, Moza, and I realized when I was reading a little bit about how this different stages this scene went through, we could see that after the financial crisis there was an effort to really build a structure for the art scene, and with more the educational structure, the residencies, more on the programs in universities and the institutions. And recently, there seemed to be also a movement away of this institutionalization of the art world in the UAE, with groups groups of artists that are coming together as collectives, not only as artists, but also across, and really wanting to distance themselves from the conversations within the umbrella of an institution. And which is extremely important, because it's almost like having went through, when art education is extremely important to really connect and review ideas and really filter ideas, and being able to distance yourself from that conversation is also being able to critique adopted modes or adopted models. Now, for an exhibition like Portrait of a Nation, to Beyond Narratives, I think you raised a very valid point that there's, first of all, unfortunately, I don't think that the exhibition was critiqued. There was no proper critique of the exhibition. There was there was a reality on the ground that things were taking place within a certain framework, that is COVID, but it wasn't enough engagement post-exhibition with the artist, besides these interviews and discussions, but really to look back and, okay, where these conversations could have, or how can we build on these conversations? And this is, when I say that the role of the cultural critique is so fundamental, beyond only the role of the artist, because I think we're also trying to unpack a lot under the responsibility of the artist. And when I say it's an ecosystem, it is, yes, the role of the institutions, but it's also the role of collective, it's the role also of educators, it's the role of the cultural critique to create, reach out to a wider public to make these conversations more reachable and understandable. Yeah, I mean, let's have another conversation afterwards, because I think you have a lot to say.
But I think you make a good point. This idea of the ethical relations between among all the parties in the art world, I think that is something that people are trying to grapple with. Even like when you think unionization in the U.S., they're trying to codify the standards of remuneration. I mean, I think there is an understanding that everything has been pushed to a breaking point, and there are like potentials for exploitation that keep on creeping in. But I think people are like, yeah, I think people are vigilant, but it's just hard to maneuver around reality. Saif, did you have a question? Yeah, go on. I don't know.
I have it. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Is it? It is.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the debate and for starting this conversation. I myself am not in the art world, but I am connected to it via friends, via my partner, and I think there's something very important that maybe, you know, there's not time or space for it to be discussed here, but I think is very common to art and scholarly disciplines, and that is the fact that we are insular, and the fact that we are disciplines, right? We have methods, we have logics, we have technologies that we have to be trained in, and that's fine. But then what do we do with that? Who do we write for? Who do we create for? Maybe that's a conversation that we should have. And also, who has access to actually produce the art and to have the art exhibited, right? Because we have, and again, there's a parallel here between scholars and artists. We have precarity, quite a bit of precarity, in, you know, how the artists make their money, how the scholars make their money, how much access do we have to these institutions, the competition that exists between the people who are trying to get the funds, who are trying to be on a stage, who are trying to have their art exhibited. And so, yeah, maybe the question from all of this is, who do you write for, who do you produce for?
Thank you.
I think there was a question.
I think I'd like to just say something very brief and very quick as well, which is just to build on what she was saying. I think that's exactly what's lost when you call it art. It's all these questions that arise, all these responsibilities and logistics that come with with calling something you created art now. You know, I think there's a lot of expectations from artworks and artists, and as well as just the fact that it loses its organic state and becomes directed. And once you do that, you lose something, which is maybe, I don't know, a form of innocence of some sort.
But isn't that the same with any kind of creative production, not just art, but anytime you convert a Word document to a PDF, you lose the capacity for potential that it had. You know, I don't think that's the. I think for me the question is really interesting because art tries to subsume so many categories. Like if you think about political efficacy, you know, when art tries to be activist, is it actually activist or is it just a gesture towards activism? And I think, you know, you don't have, literature isn't so omnivorous, you know, music isn't so omnivorous, but art is like this giant splodgy thing that tries to suck everything up. And it's amazing that it has this capacity and desire to be so wide-ranging. And it's amazing that we have institutions like the Jameel that that want to, contain your amorphous artwork, non-artwork. But I think it's an interesting moment to stop midway through the development of an art world and be like, wow, this is a strange art form that we're working with, and what does it mean to be so omnivorous? Can we handle it? Can we ethically handle wanting to bring politics in? Can we, is this containable? Do we lose something? Or actually, should we just be remarking on it and then celebrating it?
I think there's so many things to respond to Moses' comment and your comment, which there's so much truth in what they said. But when Moses was speaking, I was thinking about, in all honesty, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but I was thinking about the 2004 and the 5 and the 6 and the 7th and the 8th, and how much I personally struggled to be taken seriously at a scene that completely rejected me because of what city I came from and because of what language I preferred speaking. So exclusivity in the art world is a truth that we forgot about today because everything looks great and because we're trying really hard and because everybody is invited and everything looks accessible and because Maryam Dabagh, who was once rejected to enter a conference in 2006 because she wore a hijab, is now on a panel discussion speaking at Jameel Art Center. These truths exist, and this is something that we grapple with on a daily basis, people who were part of the scene, and we're trying to make really positive changes and trying to fight the good fight. I know Mr. Khalil is here, and Mr. Khalil was one of the very few people that believed in me when I was a kid and I said that I want to translate everything into Arabic, and he said yes, and he connected me to everybody. People saw authentic efforts by other members of the community who were trying to add into this ever-growing art scene. And alhamdulillah that we are sitting where we are sitting today. And we are so privileged and so honored to have lived to see this day where conversations like this happen. But exclusivity is the truth. And this, when you started speaking, I don't know why all of these flashbacks came that I didn't even know. I truly, I didn't even remember. I consciously remember. But I wanted to also say that museums are not the top of the hierarchy, that souks remain the top of the hierarchy, that space, the street, shara, is where it really matters, right? Definitely the farm where farms exist and the street where street life is the truth of a city. And that's why there are a lot of cultural organizations and artists and grassroots art practices that leave all of these spaces and go to the street and speak to the people. And that's, again, authentic storytelling and authentic expression. But also there are spaces within cultural organizations that open up space for people like me and maybe perhaps like Walid. And the reason I'm bringing up the Jameel Library because it's the one that commissioned my work. But it was very comfortable to be in that space versus this space. In all honesty, it's very, very comfortable to be at the left of the center where I'm sitting right now, personally for me, than to be on the other side, because there, the intimacy of people who are in between, right? People who fall between literature and art, between art and writing, between writing and photography, between research and art, is very, very much welcomed. And there's no expectation from you to continue to produce again. And there's no expectation from you to produce a portfolio of achievements to receive some sort of a grant. There's an expectation from you to speak and to show your research and to read and to exist. And these spaces exist within a lot of the cultural organizations, but they also exist within people. There are people who facilitate these things. There are people who encourage you to navigate this very strange space. I think the reason I never called myself an artist is because I'm a writer, and I didn't see the need for me to change my title in order for me to showcase my work within a group of other creatives. And I felt like it's okay for me as a writer to exist next to Walid and behind Mosa's work and write to Maisel Baker's work. And it was important. And this writer is also going to speak because when she was a kid, she wanted to be a radio host, and it was her dream to record her voice. And Nadine Ghandour from Jameel was like, we'll record your voice. We'll give you a podcast. And I was like, great. And that work then became an audio piece because I've always wanted to hear my voice out loud. And I think I'm not trying to make any statements here, and I made a lot as well, but it's it is important for us, either if we're an institution, to create these spaces, but if we're not an institution, if we're people who have a bit of impact, to actually allow for the non-conformists, for the people who live between the spaces and to practice between the spaces, to exist without the need to label them with anything, and without the expectation for them to produce, to constantly produce something that warrants recognition. Sorry, just had to say that. Thanks.
I think to add to your point, I'm having a problem to try to really, for us to try to define what art is. Because, and we cannot, yeah, and we cannot say that art, and we're merging the political. Art is political. It cannot but be political. I mean, we're political beings at the end of the day, and we are, even as artists, I mean, we're all, you are an artist, you are a creator. As long as there is an element of creation, it is, we're all artists. There's Joseph Beuys, I mean, I'm not going to, but we are. So it's just that about who, in terms of who takes it as an occupation, as really as a lifetime commitment of creating and producing work for others to create these links within society to reach a broader. So when Moza is saying that she doesn't want to be an institution while she is working with farmers, but she is acting as an artist, as creative, as an innovator within a community. And it's about increasing, and it's about allowing this to happen more and more. And it's about allowing us, a wider community, to talk about it. This is why I'm going back again to that idea of we need culture, professional cultural critique that talk about this, because they are the link, they are this exclusivity that's trying to create borders between art and society. These borders don't exist, and they should not. I mean, they exist because there is this feeling, we cannot contest it, there is a feeling of exclusivity, but it's about actually, it's about addressing it. It's about having this conversation and having artists and collectives coming together and being subversive within that system.
Well, listen, guys, we have raised a lot of questions for you, and I'm going to take Manal's question, and then I'm going to let you have more conversations and debate them among yourselves. Manal, I think you can have the last word, and then we can all really take it off the podium, off the platform, and discuss among ourselves.
Well, thanks, Melissa, for putting me on the spot with the
Yeah,
last
no problem.
Just my mind was buzzing a lot listening to a couple of things, but I did want to say one thing about institutions, since I work for an institution, is institutions are changing, and the expectations on institutions are growing at an immense rate. You can't imagine what is expected of us in terms of how we work with and who we work with and how we deal with things, from social justice to sustainability to human rights. I mean, it goes on and on. And here in the UAE, of course, we're moving in that direction, maybe slower than some institutions in other parts of the world, and sometimes a lot faster than other institutions in parts of the world. So it all really depends. But one thing that I thought, when you said, what does art take away, what do you lose when you label something art, I actually thought of it from a very positive perspective, because then later when you were talking about how you identified yourself and not thinking yourself as an artist, I felt like what happens when you label something as art is you challenge the sort of object or social schema, the psychoanalysis part of your brain that trains you to think of art as a certain way, or what it should be. So, a good 20 years ago, working in Sharjah at the Sharjah Biennial, when people walked around, there was a lot of things that did not fit in the schema, correct? So people would see something and be like, that's not art, that's like, I don't know, a liquid on the on the floor, right?
I can do that.
Yeah, for example, right? Or Hassan Sharif's work, that was just like, that's garbage, that's literally pieces of garbage, I don't understand. So but to understand schema psychologically, it's a very difficult thing to change. We're wired that way. It's what allows us to categorize information from when we're born. So it's to try to say suddenly we can challenge all of that and incorporate ideas of art or artists within a few months, a few years is a kind of unattainable task. I think what's important, and one word you were talking about, you mentioned you don't like elitism, and you talked about exclusivity. I think what we have right now is we have diversity, but we're missing equity for sure in terms of equal access to what people were talking about, funds, et cetera. But also, it's inclusiveness, I think is the word, is finding a way to think of artists and artist practices and creatives in a more inclusive way. And I think that's where, when you challenge the term art, you will get that. And I think that's a good thing. I think you don't lose much, you actually gain a lot when you say, well, this also can be art. And Maryam, who's a writer, is also an artist. And Nujum Ghanem, who was a poet, is also an artist. I mean, these are relatively challenging ideas. And I think, as you will see, it will take time. These are decades of like trying to challenge the brain to think outside of its normal way of boxing things. So I think you're all doing amazing work, and I think there's amazing people out here who are doing this all the time. But I think we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves, like we're literally wired that way. So we're always going to have that in the back of our heads, but I think being aware of it and just trying to slowly open your mind to that and to accept that as a way of looking at the world in general makes a huge difference. And I think will allow for a better ecosystem and one that's stronger in the future, I hope. So thank you for everything you shared today. It was really interesting. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I add one more thing? Sorry. I forgot one.
Do you want to ask your question?
No, I'd rather hear you first.
Yes, they've gone.
No, go ahead, because it wasn't a direct response. It was something that I wanted to say before in terms of, go ahead.
All right. Well, I just left a show where there was something up on the wall claiming to be a critique of itself. And forgive me for using this occasion to kind of treat my disillusionment there, but I'm at a bit of a loss for thesis. It is a very interesting question that got me to this talk, and I'm wondering, in the spirit of pushing this as much as we can, if the artists can tell a story in which they once called something art and lost something for it. And what did you lose personally, and how did that feel? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't get it. I'm sorry.
Right, so the question
I
being...
didn't hear properly, probably, and I didn't... What's the question? Yes.
All right. So if... should I just do that whole thing again? Or
Yes,
just
please, can you remove the mask? That would be helpful.
All right. Okay. I'll stick to the question at the end. So I'm wondering if the artists on board can kind of address the, I think, thesis issue here and tell a story in which you once called something art and lost something for it. Oh. And what did you lose and how did that feel?
I leave this to you, Walid. I just called myself a writer, so I said on the...
You got out of it, yeah?
This is so smart.
That's actually really interesting because I don't know if I'll be able to answer the question directly as you wish I would, but I'll just go ahead. I think being an artist and creating art with a purpose is the only thing I know how to do to communicate. I think art goes beyond language and beyond body language and beyond culture, and it's just again it's the overarching umbrella that engulfs everything under it. And for me to be able to call myself an artist and still feel successful with what I'm creating, I need to have a feedback that is actionary. And every time I create art and put it in a museum wall or in a gallery wall, etc., it feels very still. It doesn't feel as actionary as I hope it would be. It doesn't have that resonance. There's a lot of people who digest the work, walk away from the work, discuss the work. But especially when it comes to my sort of topics, which is political, of course, it's a very active kind of, I don't want to call it activism of any sort, again, because I believe activism is in the streets. But it's got a lot of activism in it, or like it alludes to activism. And I think once I put it up on a wall, that's taken away from it and it becomes just an idea rather than an actual action. I think that's really what I lose every time. I created a work. I was commissioned by the Jameel Art Library to to exhibit a work of mine that I created previously. It's called The Embassy of Unofficial Palestine. And it was a paper architecture project. It's mostly a research than anything else. It was, when I started it, I really wanted to build this big structure that exists in the Gulf countries, and that structure would work as an embassy for Palestinian refugees who are born in the Gulf. So it kind of facilitate kind of representation for these specific group of Palestinians. And when I created the work and I put it up on my website, I started talking about it, and in my head I wanted to create this space that is active, that actually would create change, that people would volunteer in, and I'd have lawyers and doctors and people who would actually come in and give advice to Palestinian refugees who don't feel like they have the representation that they deserve. But once I put the work in the space here, it became just an idea. It stopped being anything more than that. And it actually became a paper architecture project. So I felt like I've lost something there, which is the action that this work can take. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. But I just want to add something else on the idea of institutions and communication with the outside world and people who are not in the art scene, really. I think the biggest failure in our inclusion of people outside of the scene is the fact that we rely on institutions to do it. I believe that once you, especially in UAE, I think institutions are all that art is. Museums, institutions, galleries. But we don't have enough grassroots groups and movements that are within the people, from the people, creating for the people, without any of the elitism that comes within a very impressive structure that's been funded and money poured into. So I feel like the best solution to include people and to open borders is to actually fund these small grassroots initiatives that are kind of starting, but they're still marginalized. And funding, of course, comes with a lot of politics and a lot of responsibilities, but I think funding can be financial, but also there is a very powerful thing we can give these grassroots initiatives is by holding them to the same standards as an institute. Once we give them that credibility, then they are no longer working for an institute, but they're working alongside an institute. And then we have the organic structure, and then we have the institutional structure, and they can work together. Yeah.
We have to wrap up. Okay. All right, go for it. We can speak at like 1.5 times speed.
So, cultural criticism, it's one of the bottlenecks that exists in transmitting. And we say we need more, we need better editorial content, but the real reason for that bottleneck is censorship. And when it comes to writing about art, that's when it, becomes real. And that's one of the reasons we don't have the depth and breadth of cultural criticism that we do, because when we take the art off the wall and take it into something that's more than paper, that's when, you get shut down, for lack of a better way to put it.
Okay, so we had a panel on fire and you just lobbed a grenade. There are so many interesting points that have been made, and my mind is buzzing, and I'm so happy we had this discussion, which I feel was really interesting. So many things that were brought out, and so many things that were said, and I'm really glad for more discourse is always the answer, even if it's on these strange, overly ambitious topics like what is art. And I'm also really proud of the books that are available over there, because, little secret, I caught all of you in an amazing Zoom time when you were all stuck at home for the pandemic, but were not yet bored of being on Zoom. So there are so many amazing insights in that book, and I'm really, truly proud of, yay for you guys. No, you really, I am really, really pleased with how it turned out, and also the exhibition catalog and the exhibition were also amazing. The amount of people, the amount of research, and the different stories that are told in there are also extraordinary. And they're two really, you know, I mean, I'm totally biased, but I think they are really great additions to understanding something that we've all accomplished together. So thank you for speaking so freely. Thank you for all your questions. And now let's have some lemon mint juice.
Perfect.
Thank you.